the enormous pleasure to welcome Dr. Clint Winant. And I just want to say a few words about him before I ask him to come and give his speech tonight. Clint was an undergraduate at MIT, and then he did his PhD at the University of Southern California in LA. And he wants you all to know that actually he started out his career here at Scripps as a postdoc. He did postdoctoral research here, and he was told when he arrived that once you're here, you really can't stay as a postdoc. They never hire postdocs in a permanent position. Now, I believe that was in 1973. So either they forgot to ask him to leave, which I think is unlikely because he's now a full professor. And he's been doing research that he loves from that time on. And he works really on understanding how coastal waters behave and all the implications that that has on human populations that live on the coast. So I think it's a really fascinating topic and something that's actually very relevant to all of us here in California. Clint is also very, very proud of the fact that he's been twice nominated for teaching awards by his students. Now, he said he does not want me to read out his long list of publications and achievements, so I won't. I'm going to tell you about his wonderful blue camper instead. He is actually building in his garage a blue camper as we speak. Now, why is he doing this? Well, he and his wonderful wife, Liz, and for those of you who don't know, Liz Winant is actually the managing director here at the aquarium. And Liz is retiring in December, and they are going to go down to Baja California for the first few months of next year. And they're going to be doing some research on water circulation in one of the lagoons in Baja. And they're going to go in this amazing blue camper. So I thought that was a very important thing I wanted you to know about tonight. So without further ado, Clint, I would like you to speak to us tonight about the complex interface between land and sea in your talk entitled Where Fresh and Salt Water Meet, the Dynamics of Coastal Lagoons in Southern California.
Thank you, Nigella. That's a very nice introduction, and I'm grateful to you. So this evening, I want to share with you what I've learned about these coastal lagoons, and I also want to tell you sort of why I'm so excited about these places. There's a more or less uninterrupted string of coastal lagoons along the coast of the Californias, coming down from San Francisco all the way down to Cabo and around the corner up into the Sea of Cortez. The largest ones are illustrated on this map, are located on this map, but of course there are many, many more. There are hundreds of them of the size of San Dieguito or Penasquitos or even Bolsa Chica that Marilyn was talking to me about a little bit earlier. And I study the water circulation in these places. I have to begin by fessing up that I'm not a biologist. I don't know anything about the marine life in there. I'm going to show you a few pictures, but for those of you who have questions about the marine life, I'll refer you immediately to Jeff Graham, the outstanding authority on everything biologic in these lagoons. Is that right, Jeff? Not really. Maybe. You could try Jeff, and then if that doesn't work, we'll go somewhere else. But I really want to talk to you about the water circulation, how mixing takes place, and most important of all, how the waters in the lagoon are exchanged with the waters in the ocean so that the lagoon can maintain itself as a healthy ecosystem. If the connection is breached, if there's no connection between the water in the lagoon and the open ocean, then the lagoon becomes a large cesspool and everything dies in it. So we need to maintain that open, and I'm going to try to explain to you why and how that exchange takes place. Now, you're all familiar here with at least some of the lagoons in San Diego County. And you all know that they've been extensively modified. We have extensively modified them. We've dammed the rivers that used to feed them. We've dredged through them. We've built up on the sides. And as a result, most of them are just become marginal habitats, if they're habitats at all. South of us, on the Mexican side of the Californias, there's been much less interference, and in some cases, no interference at all. And studying those systems teach us how the unaltered lagoons work. and can even help us understand how we could remediate some of the bad actions that have been taken north of the border. So we'll talk a little bit about what happens in Mexico. A little bit later we'll talk about some of the lagoons here in Northern California. Why do we care at all about these places? It's an obvious question to you, but to some, surprisingly, they just don't really understand what function they serve beyond being just magically beautiful. We know here, all of us, that from an ecological perspective, these are very, very important places. They're unique resting and even wintering places for some of the migrating species, all the way from the smallest invertebrates to the marine mammals. And the other very important function they serve is as a nursery. Small juvenile fish in particular come into the lagoons protected from the large predators where they can grow, reach adult stage, and then go back out. So what I want to do is I want to start by just introducing you to some of my favorite animals, or some of the animals that I like to see in these lagoons. I can't normally see the ghost shrimp. They're small, and they live most of their life burrowing through the sand. But they're a very important fellow, because as they burrow in through the sediment there, they bring in fresh water, they bring in nutrients, and they keep the other colleagues that live in the sediment happy. They basically maintain a healthy, muddy bottom in the sediment. Halibut and mullet are good examples of fish who spend their juvenile stage in the coastal lagoons. If they had to spend their juvenile fish in the stage in the open ocean, they wouldn't make it. They'd be chewed up right away by the larger predators that exist. So both halibut and mullet swim into the lagoons. They have to do this. They have to find a lagoon. How they do this is a mystery, I think, even to the biological oceanographers, but some of them manage to. They grow, and once they get stronger and adults, they go back into the ocean, and then the cycle repeats itself. On the bird side, this little fellow, Belding savanna sparrow, likes to live in salt marshes. And as we've sort of removed much of that habitat, and as we've sort of destroyed many of the salt marshes, that bird is nearly extinct. It's been listed in the California list of endangered species since 1974, and it's just got the dubious honor of being listed on the federal list of endangered species. So this is an animal who's well, probably won't be seeing it much more in the future. Another lovely bird is the willet. The willet is a large sandpiper. We see them mostly on the shore, but it needs fresh water to breed. And so they come into the coastal lagoons and use that environment. Without coastal lagoons, we wouldn't have the willet. Another bird that I think is quite fascinating is the marble godwit. This animal actually breeds in the central plains of North America all the way up to Manitoba. And then, like many of our relatives, it tends to come in winter in Southern California, enjoys the winter here with the beaches, and then when it gets a little bit warmer, flies back home. My all-time favorite animal in the coastal lagoon is this great blue heron, who you'll find almost always perched on the southeastern side of the bridge over San Dieguito Lagoon there, Highway 101. And it just sits there and waits. And then when a good-sized fish comes by, it just dunks in, eats the fish, and goes away. But the reason I like it so much isn't because it's a splendid animal or because it eats fish, but it also eats gophers. And gophers I don't like anywhere near as much. Of course, you can't show a picture of the fauna in the lagoons without showing a picture of the gray whale. This is a calf reaching out of the water, learning how to swim, as it were, in Laguna San Ignacio in Mexico, a place that I'll tell you much more about later. So let me take you now down to Mexico, down to a part of the world that I really love, and as Nigella said earlier, Liz and I are going to go spend some time in. These two large coastal lagoons, Laguna Ojo de Liebre and Laguna San Ignacio, are two of the three mating and calving grounds of the Pacific gray whale. They're about 50 miles long. The top one up there, Ojo de Liebre, is about 50 miles long. And the smaller one, Laguna San Ignacio down here, is about 30 miles in extent and maybe 6 miles wide. They're large bodies of water. The weather in this area here is quite arid, very dry, and the wind blows like stink year-round down along the coast like this. And the result of all that is that there's a large amount of evaporation over these lagoons down there. This curve here, the heavy solid curve, shows you the evaporation rate as a function of month of year. And a minimum value occurs in February when there's still about 10 inches of water evaporating during the month of February. And then when you get up here in August, it's a couple of feet of water. Now, to give you some perspective on that, that means that over a year in this area here, a column of water over 10 feet, or about 50 times taller than I am, evaporates. If you had a tank of water at the beginning of the year, 10 feet high, at the end of the year, it would be empty. Huge amount of water, fresh water, is removed from all the oceans and lagoons in this area. That's impressive enough, but the other thing that happens, of course, is when the water evaporates, it leaves the salt behind. All right? And basically, in Laguna San Ignacio, which I showed you earlier, there is, on average, deposited 1,000 pounds of salt every second. All right? A huge amount of salt is left behind. Nobody's pouring salt down in the lagoon, but you're removing all this fresh water, and the salt stays behind. And that's equivalent, once again, to 1,000 pounds every second. Huge amount of salt. All right? Well, what happens to that salt? If the salt just stayed in the lagoon, essentially by now we wouldn't have a lagoon left. It would all be rock salt, right? You kept pouring 1,000 pounds a second onto this lagoon. After a few years, let alone a few millennia, there wouldn't be any lagoon left. So there must be some mechanism by which the salt is returned back to the ocean. And this little cartoon, if you think of the open ocean as being on the left here, these little arrows are trying to show the evaporation. As the ocean water comes into the lagoon, enters, it becomes saltier because of evaporation. It sinks and it returns back to the ocean. So there's this sort of pattern of return flow. We call this the residual circulation. And the residual circulation is what drives the exchange of waters between the lagoon and the adjacent ocean. The residual circulation is key to the ecological health of the lagoon, because if you're dumping a bunch of crap in this part of the lagoon, like you have a storm drain or some factory dumping stuff out, what takes that stuff out of the lagoon and returns it back into the ocean is exactly this residual circulation. All right? So the point of my talk today is going to be to work you through how this system works. And the first part of what I'm going to do is going to be to talk to you about a little bit of theory. But before doing that, the point is that we have a bunch of mixing taking place between the lagoon waters and the ocean. And in fluid mechanics, which I teach here, we distinguish between mixing and stirring. And Liz and I put together this tiny little animation here to try to illustrate this. So let's see if I can make the animation work. Here we go. So this is a little movie that we've made. And imagine that you wake up in the morning, you make a cup of nice, strong coffee here, and you go, oh my gosh, that's too strong. I'd like to put a little cream in that. We're going to try to mix that up. So pick up the cream pot, pour it in. This is running a little bit slower than it was filmed. So. And the cream just sort of spreads over the top. Now you could just simply wait for that cream to mix in with the coffee beneath by molecular diffusion. And after 3 or 4 or 5 days, you'd have a nice mixture of coffee and cream. But you usually don't want to wait that long. And so what you all do is what Liz is going to do in a moment. You just pick up the spoon here and you mix. Okay? We call this stirring. And stirring really has to do with the fact that you're taking these fluid parcels, you're taking this coffee and this cream, and you're stretching the interface between them so much that molecular action can then take place. All right? So what we need to get effective mixing is a stirring mechanism. We need a spoon. And what I want to try to do for a while then is to tell you what the spoon is in these lagoons. So in lagoons and estuaries, there are these 4 kinds of mechanisms that provide the spoon. All right? If the wind blows over the lagoon and estuary, I'll tell you at long length what that does. If tides are pumping the estuary or the lagoon up and down, that will mix as well. There's also evaporation and precipitation. I won't say much about that. And then if there's an estuary, if there's a river running through the estuary, like there used to be in San Diego, then that will provide a mixing mechanism as well. But for the remainder of this talk, we're going to talk about winds and tides. Now, let's first imagine the first part of this bit, the next 10 minutes or so are going to be some theory. All right? So you have to bear with me here. I'm going to try to make it as amusing as possible, but imagine that we have an ocean here. This is the bottom of the ocean. This is the surface. And we have a wind blowing across the top of the ocean in this direction. What do you think happens? Well, the little animation I'm going to show you is going to show that water parcels near the surface are driven downwind. Water parcels near the bottom, in fact at all depths, are driven downwind, but with varying amplitude so that the near surface most water goes fastest downwind than the other one. And that's sort of fairly straightforward, but it just sets the stage for what will come later. So let's see. All right, there we go. The wind starting. Now the wind reaches a steady value. The wind's now steady, but the water parcels continue to displace downstream. Okay, so the definition of a fluid is that when it's subject to a stress at the surface like it is here, it continuously deforms. That's why you put oil in your engine, right? If this part is your piston and this part is your cylinder wall, you have oil in there. It continues to deform as this thing goes on. All right, so that's what might happen in the deeper ocean. Now let's go on and see what might happen in a lagoon. A lagoon, as opposed to the deeper ocean, is closed at one end. Imagine this is the open ocean. This is the closed end of your lagoon. If you start blowing a wind across, you can't have all of the water in the lagoon going in the same direction because you'd slosh all the water out, and that doesn't happen. Okay. So what you're going to see happens in this animation is as the wind starts, you'll notice that the sea level here begins to tilt, and it tilts in a way which is opposite to the wind stress. So initially, the wind starts blowing, the current's in the same direction, piles a bunch of water down into this end, the water level rises and creates a pressure gradient, which then is going to return fluid down at the bottom, because we have to have so the wind acting over a lake or a closed basin like this is going to produce this kind of circular motion as illustrated in this animation here. So now you notice that the near surface water is still going downwind, but at depth the water is coming back. It's going upwind back towards the ocean. And this is a spoon. We're stirring the waters in this lagoon. The wind is producing a stirring, bringing relatively clean ocean water into the lagoon and taking out the soiled water or whatever the lagoon water was back out to the ocean. We've got this mixing mechanism taking place. All right, let's go on a little bit further still and complicate the picture just one or two more steps here. Okay, now two more animations, and for these I need to orient you. In these little basins here, your back is you're looking down here. Your back is towards the ocean. So you are looking from the ocean towards the closed end of the lagoon. All right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to release 7 little water parcels here in this basin. And now this basin has a slightly more realistic shape. It's shallow on the sides and it's deep in the center, like there's a deep channel. And the two animations are going to run in parallel. One neglects the effect of the rotation of the Earth, what we call the Coriolis acceleration. And the other one includes the effect of the Coriolis acceleration. And those of you who are into this business know that under the effect of the rotation of the Earth, parcels tend to go to the right of their direction. And so what you'll see is that the parcels on this side tend to veer off to the right. Okay, so let's try to get that one going. Left, no rotation, parcels go at the surface, go down to the end, dive to the bottom, come back out again. When you include the effect of rotation of the Earth, these guys are just spiraling their way in very, very slowly. Okay, and so one of the interesting things that we learn here by looking at this is that when you include the effect of the rotation of the Earth, it's important because it really increases the residence time of parcels of water in the lagoon. If you don't have any rotation of the Earth, stuff goes into the surface, hits the end, goes back, scoots right back out again. Might stay in the lagoon a day or so. But when you include this effective rotation of the Earth, there's this funny spiraling effect. They all eventually get to the back, but then they kind of come back in funny little ways. See, these guys are spiraling back out in the middle and coming back out. And their residence time could be up to 10 times longer. So because of the effective rotation of the Earth, it takes quite a bit longer to exchange water parcels from the ocean into the lagoon and back out as a function of time. All right. That's the theory that was the extent of the theory about wind-driven circulation. Now let's talk a little bit about tides. what do tides do? Okay. In the simplest way, what tides do is they're going to take the sea level and go up and down. The deep ocean here is driving with some tides. The sea level in the lagoon wants to stay the same as in the deep ocean. It moves up and down, and to move up and down, the water beneath it must be coming in and out. In other words, to provide fluid to move this point up and down, it must be driven in. And so in that sense, what we expect to see then as an animation, if you see this tidal, the surface, the free surface is going up and down, and to supply the mass needed to do that, the water inside the lagoon is just moving in and out. All right, that's fairly straightforward, but that's not very useful to us because there's no stirring associated with it. It's just like a slinky. You compress it, you move it back out, compress it, move it back out, but there's no tearing apart. There's no straining of the water parcels. So tidal motion of this kind wouldn't be very useful. Unfortunately, that's not a very realistic picture of what the tides do. Let me try to do a little bit better then. A slightly more complicated thing. Now let's include the effect of friction. Friction at the bottom of the lagoon basically retards flow. Because at the bottom there's a hard bottom, the water velocity tends to be less near the bottom than it is at the surface. And so now all of a sudden the velocity is not going to be uniform at every point. There's going to be a large velocity near the surface and a smaller velocity near the bottom. So let me show you how that works. Now you see large velocity at the surface, small velocity at the bottom. And the result of all that is after an even number of tidal cycles, as you'll see, there's a small displacement that's superimposed upon this. And so you're going to end up, after 5 or 6 tidal cycles, which should be coming up next time, I think. There? Right there. This is after 5 tidal cycles. There's been a net displacement of the surface towards the inner part of the lagoon and a net displacement at the bottom towards the outside. And this now is a spoon. We're beginning to move stuff in a regular fashion. Superposed on this oscillation, there's a net little progression towards the closed part of the lagoon at the surface, and at the bottom, as you're coming out, there's a net little displacement coming back out. We call that, again, the residual circulation, and that's a mixing mechanism. And now, of course, to make the problem in its more complex fullness here, I'm going to show you, again, two animations. Once more, your back is now to the ocean. You're looking towards the closed end of the lagoon. On the left side, you're going to see the result of a complicated numerical calculation that doesn't include the effect of rotation. On the right, with rotation. And let me just show you what that does. And if you feel seasick, you can step out to the tide pool for a moment. But so the water parcels are sort of bouncing in and out, going back and forth and all that. But you can see, particularly down here, that there's funny things happen. The water parcels that were started uniformly distributed are beginning to collect into given areas. And that's going to make little jets of water that are going to come out in specific areas, other little jets of water that are going to go in specific areas. And that's exactly what we need to stir. This is a spoon, again, that provides us all these kinds of mechanisms. All right? The last image that you see here shows the net displacement between the starting position. For instance, this black dot started at this point, and 5 tidal cycles later, it's up here. So there's been a net displacement in. Down here, this little water parcel started near the bottom at mid-depth and came down. So there's a lot of stirring and mixing and stuff like that going on. Okay, enough of theory. If we have all these lovely theoretical ideas and we can get pretty good predictions of what we think goes on, how do we have any idea that this has anything to do with reality? Well, at that point, then we go into the field. And we make a bunch of measurements. And we were very fortunate here at Scripps to be involved in a program to measure the circulation in Laguna San Ignacio, which I showed you before. This lovely satellite image shows you the fact that there are these deep channels that run all the way near the top, the shallow sides. In some areas, the topography of the channels is very complicated. Here near the entrance, there's actually 3 distinct channels separated by shoal areas. How do we go about understanding what happens in this place? And that's basically what I want to talk about for the next part of this talk. Field observations of Laguna San Ignacio if you're going to measure anything about a lagoon, you better measure for at least a year, because there's a big seasonal cycle. The largest signal that we have is seasonal variations, and so you need to understand what happens in the winter, contrasted with the summer. If you just measure for a month in the summer, what does that tell you about what happens on an average? Nothing. So we have to go out and measure for a year. And in my field, we basically resort to 3 techniques. One, we try to measure every 2 or 3 months to know what the water mass properties are, and for that we use an instrument called a CTD that I'm going to tell you something about. Another is that we need to place instruments permanently over the bottom to measure continuously what happens for a period of the year in case of episodic events. If a big storm comes through and mixes everything up, and you're only measuring every 3 months and you miss that, then you don't have a clue what really happened. So we deploy moored stations that are occupied permanently for periods of at least a year, and I'll show you how we do that. And finally, these moored stations tell you a lot about the velocity, but they don't really tell you where parcels go. And if we want to know where parcels go, where the water goes, then we deploy drifters, and we track them over long periods of time to see what they go. So at this point in time, it's more like, let's talk a little bit about what we do and how we play with all these toys. The first thing I want to show you is a picture of a CTD. The CTD, this particular instrument here, is actually made in San Diego, a company called Ocean Sensors run by Kim McCoy. And the instrument itself has a little computer inside of it, a bunch of batteries. And at the business end up here, it has a set of sensors that measure the temperature, the salinity, and the pressure. And these are recorded then every minute or so. And this fellow takes this package in this boat, goes off the pier, goes off to some spot, lowers it with a rope all the way to the bottom, brings it back up to the surface, and goes off and does this again and again and again. And once he's done this for about 2 or 3 days in a row and so sick of it he can't stand it anymore, he brings the data home, gives it to us, and we make maps. Now we know what the structure of the salinity and the temperature are as a function of depth at all these different spots in the lagoon. And so we can come up with maps like the following. This is simply a map. It's a section from the deep open ocean end of Laguna San Ignacio all the way up to the closed end where the depth is 1 meter or so. This section is along the deepest part of the lagoon, so the boat's gone up that axis, that central axis of the lagoon, and measured salinity as a function of depth. And what you see is near the ocean here, the salinity is about 24 PSU. And as we go into the shallower parts of the lagoon, the salinity does increase all the way up to 28 PSU. And that, of course, is the result of that evaporation I told you about before. So water evaporates, leaves the salt behind, and you get an excess salinity near the closed end of the lagoon. If you these measurements were made during neap tides, when there's relatively little mixing associated with the tides. And a week later, we went back and redid the same survey during spring tides. And you'll notice that the salinity difference from the ocean to the closed end is much less during spring tides when the mixing is larger than it is during neap tides. So all this makes sense, and this gives us a nice overall view of what happens in the lagoon. But it doesn't tell us anything about what happens at any point in time. To find out what happens at any point in time, we deploy instruments, and in particular, we love to deploy this animal here, which is called an acoustic Doppler current profiler. This too is made in San Diego by a company called RDI. And the way it works is kind of complicated, but I'm sure you're up to this. Each one of these little heads here is an acoustic transducer, sends out a beam of sound every second. Beep, it goes, and then it shuts up and listens to the response. And if it hears beep, a higher frequency, it says, aha, the water along that beam must have been coming towards me, because it's just like the train coming towards me, I hear a higher pitch. If it hears beep, then it says, aha, the water along this beam must have been gone away from me because the pitch is lower. And so it analyzes the return from the ocean and tells us the velocity along these 4 beams, which we then rotate and come up with 2 components of horizontal velocity and 1 vertical velocity. So this thing we stick down in the bottom of the ocean. And I know some of you are interested in sort of how we do this, and so I brought this slide purposely to explain to you how we install an instrument on the bottom of a lagoon or the ocean and keep it there for a period of 12 months. I mean, that's not a trivial thing. Try taking anything that you own of value and putting it in the bottom of the ocean and come back 12 months and with high hopes of finding it, and you'll find that it's really not a piece of cake. There's just the natural question of finding it, but then also there's vandalism and breakage and leaks and all this stuff. The method that we at Scripps have sort of converged on consists of installing these instruments in sort of cubical aluminum frames like this one. Okay, so this is a frame in which the instrument is installed. We lower this frame over the side, and we have to sort of anchor it then to the ocean floor. And that's what these 3 long tubes, there should be 4, these tubes serve that purpose. These tubes go down with the instrument, and then these divers go down along with this big fire hose, jet a bunch of water in the top of the tube, and that just drives that pipe all the way right down into the sand. And so at that point, this frame is basically nailed to the bottom of the ocean, and it stays there pretty much for 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 months at a time. Then we go back, and usually we find them, but we don't always find them, and those are the heartbreak moments in our business. Anyway, what do we do with this kind of thing? Well, that instrument that I showed you measures currents, but it also measures pressure. This is a complicated result, but I wanted to sort of try to take you through it once because it's going to show you how we work and how we gather conclusions from these kinds of things. So bear with me a little bit, and if you don't follow all of it, that's perfectly fine. There'll be more fun stuff in a little bit. We deployed instruments like the ones I just showed you at these 4 locations in Laguna San Ignacio. Each one measures pressure, and we have anemometers on the side of the lagoon that measure wind. And so what we can do is we can make comparisons between, for instance, in this case, the red curve shows you the wind measured on the side of the lagoon, so that we know what the forcing by the wind is. And the dark curve shows us the pressure difference between these 2 measurements here, points 1 and 2. All right, so we've taken pressure measurements. We now know what the pressure gradient is between points 1 and 2. It's a black curve. And we look at the red curve and the black curve, and we say, look at that. Every time the black curve goes high, the red curve has gone high too. That we take to be a cause and effect relationship. If every time this guy goes in one direction, the other guy goes in the same direction, then we have what we call a cause and effect relationship. And we conclude from this is the pressure difference between points 1 and 2. We conclude from this kind of a curve that the pressure and the circulation in the top part of the lagoon must be driven by the wind stress. All right? Wind stress drives the circulation in the shallow part of the lagoon. And by a comparable measurement, the pressure difference in the lower part of the lagoon, which is shown here in this black curve, looks almost exactly like the tide. And so we concluded in the bottom part of the lagoon, the circulation is driven by tides. All right, so unfortunately, it's never a simple answer. You can't just say, oh, look, in this kind of big body of water, the wind does everything. It does in part of it, but not everywhere. And so the complexity that we have to deal with is the multiplicity of forces that come into play and the fact that they vary as a function of time. But that's kind of how we go about making these decisions. Now, what do we do with drifters? We want to imagine that we say, okay, we parcel of water right here in this part of the lagoon now. Where does it going to go? How do we track that? Well, we've come up with these devices that are called surface following drifters, and they're very simple devices, really. It's a PVC tube down here in the middle with a couple of PVC rods sticking out the side of it on which we mount some sails. All right? And all that will be suspended, as you'll see in a moment, by these little spheres. What we need to do is we need to measure the position of this thing as time progresses. And so how do we do that? Because we're not anywhere near this thing at that point. Well, we do that most simply by going to the store and buying one of these little handheld GPS units, and we just stick it in the top of this thing, close the cap, and throw the whole thing overboard. All right, so we do that, take this little GPS, put batteries in it, reset the memory, put it in here, and this thing will work for about 8 days and tell us the track of where that thing has been, so long as we find it at the end of 8 days. All with that question. Here's what the animal looks like in the water then. You can see the little sails down here is the water. The floats basically keep keep it at a fixed distance from the water, so these buoys follow the water at a fixed distance. The little flag is to help us find us after several days, so when you're going around on the boat, you have a better chance of finding it. And we originally thought that these little lights would be a great idea. It would help us find them at night, and they do, but they also help fishermen find them at night. And so we began recovering these things with the cap off and no GPS in them. So at this point, we're not using the little lights anymore. There is a vandalism part to what we do, which is, anyway. What do these things tell us? How do we use the data that we get back from these things? Well, again, Laguna San Ignacio, these are the trajectories of 5 drifters that were deployed for a period of 3 days. And I'm going to show you the actual individual trajectories in an animation in a moment, but just to locate you, we deployed these drifters at on the center line of the lagoon, so here, 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 and here. And this is the total trajectory that they followed during that 5-day period of time. And what you can see is that it's not just like that initial picture I showed you, the tides, where the stuff just goes in and comes back all within the same place. There, you'll see there is some back and forth motion, but there's also a net drift. And in fact, most of these drifters were recovered beach on this shore. Okay, so there they go. Little babes are released. The tide's flooding in. Now the tide reverses. They go back out again. So we've just covered 6 hours. Go back down, reverse again after 6 more hours, go back in. But the point here is that they don't keep going back and forth on top of themselves. There's a net drift of this trajectory as these guys fall out. In fact, that green trajectory just hit shore. The trajectories disappear when we actually recover them from the water. Here's another one that was redeployed. And so that's basically the kind of information we get. And we use this information then to verify the models that we have, those theories that I showed you before. And by now we're at the point where we get very good agreement between them. So that's all that we've learned in Mexico. Now I'm going to bring you back to this side of the border and talk to you just a little bit about this place here, which you all probably drive back and forth on the freeway several times a week, if not every day like we do. San Dieguito Lagoon, here's the racetrack. And the lagoon itself, I presume before they built Lake Hodges and dammed that, used to basically be something like this, all right? But what maintained that lagoon was the water flowing down the San Dieguito River, and we needed the water to do something else. So we dammed Lake Hodges. And so there's just a trickle of water comes down from Lake Hodges anymore. The water that you see in here now is maintained when the lagoon is open. And most of the water, the freshwater input to this place is storm sewer drains that bring all the crap from our streets down into the lagoon if it's not open. In addition, we had the great idea of sort of filling in the middle part of this to build a racetrack. I mean, this is sort of, each one of these things at the time seemed like a great idea. Hey, we'll get a lot of water if we can dam Lake Hodges, or boy, wouldn't it be fun if we had a racetrack? But the part of that equation that we forget is, well, what are we doing to this place here and what's happening there? So hopefully nowadays I think the thinking is a little bit more complicated and we try to factor all these parts into the problem. But this lagoon now, being as small as it is, does not have a large amount of tides coming in and out. See, when it was large like all this area here, you needed a lot amount of water coming in at the opening here to raise the water up and down in this large body of water. Now that it's this tiny little place here, there's a small amount of water that's required to come in. And because that amount of water is small, the velocities at the entrance are small, and accordingly, then the opening can close. And when San Dieguito Lagoon closes in the summer, as it usually does, at that point it becomes a cesspool until somebody comes in with a big crane or a bulldozer and opens it up again. All right? So if we look at what happens then, this is a set of measurements made by Mark Page and Steve Schroeder, who work for UC Santa Barbara and the Coastal Commission. And they're made in near the railway bridge in San Dieguito Lagoon at the time when the lagoon was opened. All right. So for a period of about 3 or 4 months ahead of time here, the lagoon had been closed. Lagoon's closed, the tidal height doesn't change, there's no connection with the ocean. The salinity has gone down from the 26 or 27 parts per thousand that you get in open ocean down to a brackish value. The temperature has continued to go down to reach basically the temperature of the surrounding waters. And the oxygen has lowered from maybe 8 milligrams per liter, which is typical of healthy conditions, down to near zero. When it gets at zero, everything in the place dies and floats belly up, and people don't like that. So at that point, or just before that happens, the water quality guys say, oh, okay, go ahead and open the damn place. So they come in with a bulldozer, they open the place, and then what you see happens is, of course, immediately what happens is the tides come in, and so you get the fluctuating water level, water going up and down. The salinity starts rising, and as it comes up to near ocean values, it's also modulated by the tide. But it recovers to full ocean values in about 5 days. So once you've opened that lagoon, we now know it takes about 5 days for it to come back to the healthy conditions that we'd like to see there. And the oxygen, of course, comes back up again, going through the kind of cycles we see going. All right, so these are kinds of things that happen in the lagoons all up and down our coast here. We were asked at one point to try to measure what happens in the coastal ocean here. This is Del Mar down here. This is Solana Beach up here. This is the opening to the lagoon. And this is on the day where the lagoon was opened. And local residents in the city of Del Mar and the city of Solana Beach were concerned about the quality of the water along these beaches as all this water trapped behind San Diego Lagoon came out. And so they asked us to release some drifters right in the opening here, just at the moment when the crane dug the last bunch of sand out, and keep releasing drifters for the following 6 hours. And so we did that. And this shows you some of the drifters, but I'm going to show you again the last animation here. And there they go. So we're popping drifters out about every half an hour here. And you watch them go. The total period of time that you're going to see here covers about 8 hours, and it takes place in about 20 seconds, so it's quite sped up. But the one point I want to make here is notice that these drifters come out, but they don't go very far. And so this water that's come out, rather poor water quality from the lagoon, has basically stayed in this area for that whole day. And I wouldn't go swimming in that. Well, I like to swim there, but I'm not going to go swimming there anymore after they've opened the lagoon for several days. And I wouldn't even take my dog, if I had one, down here on those days, because I think it might be quite a sick puppy, if a puppy it was. Anyway.
What pollutants do they find?
Well, basically, the major problem is the low oxygen. It's the fact that this water has got a low oxygen, but it's also it's full of what they call bacteria. We call those fecal indicator bacteria. There's a suite of 3 bacteria, which are Enterococcus, and I forget what the other 2 are, that the county health department associates with people getting sick. They don't know whether these particular bacteria get people sick, so that's why they call them indicator bacteria. But they say when these bacteria are present in the waters, that's the time when people will get sick. And they find a lot of these at this point. That's when you see the health department put up the little signs that say, don't swim here. But the problem with that, of course, is that when they put up the sign, it's been 2 days since they've taken the sample, because it takes them 2 days to take the sample, incubate it, and measure the thing. So they tell you 2 days after there's been a problem that there's been a problem at a time when the water's probably fine, and you had no clue that the water was dangerous when you went in. So there's a real problem with that. How do you announce to people, how do you keep people current about the situation of the health situation of our beaches? All right, so where does all this lead us? And Nigella's already told you where all this leads Liz and I. It leads us down here to this lovely lagoon in Bahia Concepcion. Right there is where we're going. The reason that we're going there is that the lagoons that I've talked to you about earlier, these 2, are the smaller ones that we have around here, are all quite shallow. They're maybe 10 feet deep, maybe 20 feet deep at the most. This lagoon out here is very different. This part of land is rising, this part of land is lowering. The depth in the lagoon is at least 100 feet. And so we expect to see very different conditions here than we do in the other lagoons, and it's going to be an extreme test for our models of the ocean. At least that's the excuse that we're giving ourselves to go sailing off to these places. It's a beautiful, beautiful place we're going to. This is Sunset. This is a little harbor that our Mexican colleagues keep the boat in. That's the boat that we operate from, the Argos. And this is a view looking east at sunset. So this is a little beach, and that's that finger of land that moves its way up. I've kept you a long time. Let me finish by showing you this picture of moonrise over Bahia Concepcion, and take a moment to tell you that the work that I've talked to you about here represents efforts of a large amount of people to whom I'm very indebted. My Mexican colleagues who support all of our work, especially my friends who are engineers and technicians here at Scripps who've manufactured all these wonderful devices, make them work, come up with the techniques of deploying them. My colleague Merle Hendershot, my students who actually do the work, and the postdoc who actually keeps the shop going while we go off and have all this fun. So with that, thank you very much. These lagoons are part of something that's called a biosphere reserve, and it is protected by the Mexican government. There is a big reserve organization that takes place there. These lagoons are fortunate in that they are in the eye of the world as a mating and calving ground of the Pacific gray. So anything happens in there, everybody gets very alarmed, and as you probably heard several years ago, there was a big controversy about the San Ignacio Lagoon. So we're not worried about what's going to happen in those lagoons. We're much more worried about what happens to the small places. Okay, something can happen in San Dieguito. The local San Dieguito people will be upset, but it's harder to. There's a lot of the little places, and we just don't have the energy to go after each one of these. So I think if anything good happens tonight, is to try to get you all motivated to think about and listen to what happens. All development is not bad at all. Some is good, some is reasonable. But you just need to be aware of what's going on and think about it and express your opinion about it. The principle that I've tried to show you here happen on all sorts of scales within ocean basins. And the next scale up from these lagoons are the marginal seas, such as the Black Sea or the Sea of Cortez, the Gulf of California, or even to some smaller extent the Mediterranean. What the difference between and so why don't I say about, well, the whole damn ocean too? And the difference between what happens in places like the Black Sea or these lagoons and what happens in the whole damn ocean, if you'll excuse me, is the fact that over the ocean, the wind doesn't blow uniformly over the whole ocean. There's differences between the winds and stuff like that. Whereas in these smaller basins, the marginal seas or the lagoons, the wind blows everywhere at the same strength. And so the models that I've shown you are like that. But you're absolutely right. All of these water bodies follow the same physical mechanisms and these residual circulation patterns. First of all, let me start by saying I'm not the person to ask because I'm not being a biologist. I don't really have all the elements to be able to make an intelligent assessment of what the issues involved are. Having said that, I know that quite a few Mexican scientists and quite a few scientists from Scripps here in Rixala in particular are working on that project and trying to work with the Mexican government to minimize the impact of these things. They've set aside a large area as a park to protect parts of the ecosystem. So they're trying to come up with an intelligent trade-off that will satisfy as many people as possible. It certainly seems to be, I think the fair thing to say is there's certainly much more available information to the people who are responsible for managing that system that was available to people who were trying to manage our lagoons when we were building all over them. There's a better understanding of that, and that understanding is absolutely available in Mexico as much as it is here. Why don't they continually keep it open? You probably mean, and they should. I mean, they really should. First of all, there's the old question of dinero. right? It costs, as you know, it costs money to keep that big equipment out there. But also, there's just this enormous question of making the political process work. I mean, even if everybody was in agreement to do it, the permitting required to do something like that is fantastic. But everybody isn't in agreement with do it. I mean, some of the owners there think it's a great idea. Some of the homeowners think, no, you should never do this. They sue each other. I mean, that's sort of what we do these days. And so it's really a complicated thing. And you have to get to near emergency conditions where you start seeing fish floating belly up and the place starts reeking for, okay, yeah, we got to do something about it. You know. We can kiss off any idea of water coming from inland into these bodies of water anymore. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, our society has demands on that water that will never equate politically to these things that we hold important here. But you can keep these areas open, and you can improve the tidal flushing regime. And as the Coastal Commission with Southern Cal Edison is doing in San Diego, you can make an effort to come up with a reasonable ecosystem in these places. And I think that that's a very valid thing to pursue. The answer is I have not, and that's not because it isn't happening, but because we simply are not able, we don't have the resources to follow all of those lagoons continuously. And that's a great shame, but it's very, very difficult to find funds. It's much easier for us at Scripps to get funded to work in Mexico than it is to work in San Diego County. Isn't that mind-boggling? I've never understood that, but it's true. Well, of course, the whole Laguna San Ignacio controversy was just about that. The mining company there, which is a 51% partnership, Mexican government, 49% Mitsubishi, wanted to expand their operation into Laguna San Ignacio. So there is always pressure to do those things. That particular effort was shot down by the Mexican president. And that operation in and of itself is sort of interesting. I mean, these guys down there are taking seawater and sunlight to make an industrial product. And so as kind of gentle industrial activities are concerned, that's certainly one of them. But as the Mexican president said at the time, there are aesthetic values of beauty that are important to Mexico as they are to us here. And in some cases, it's just better not to go forward to do those things. Well, you're right, I didn't, and because I've focused on lagoons, and the offhand comment I made earlier is that in Southern California, there just isn't going to be much fresh water coming to the lagoons except the garbage that comes out of the storm drains. But the whole point of what happens in a real estuary, like say San Francisco Bay, where there's large amounts of fresh water coming in, this exchange process that I talked to you about and the residual circulation is all controlled by the amount of fresh water that comes out. And the concern then of some of the environmentalists in the north part of our state is that if you start reducing the amount of fresh water that comes out there by diverting it to come down and feed us, then that's going to change that whole ecosystem up there as well. But I don't know as much about that as I do about this, and I don't really know that much about this either.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.